Good morning. Good morning, colleagues. Good evening. And thank you for joining us for the second session of this third week in the course on fostering the social and professional reintegration of returning migrants. And it's my pleasure to introduce once again Professor Jean-Pierre Cassarino, who is going to be with us today for the session. And during the session today, we're going to focus on migrants reintegration through entrepreneurship. So this is a session where we often have a lot of questions, and we're very much looking forward to the discussion and to hearing also from your side, from the participants who are online with us today. As usual, the session is being recorded, and the recording will be posted on the eCampus afterwards. So if you would like to review, rewatch, that's always a possibility in advance of the quiz that will be opened at the end of the week. You already know by now how it works. So if you would like to ask questions at any point, if you would like to share your comments, your experiences, your reflections, you are more than welcome to do so. You can either post it in the chat and we can pick it up from there, or we can give you the floor directly. It's a relatively intimate group. So feel free to also raise your hand and we can give you the floor directly. I think I've given you all of the let's say the housekeeping information for now. Perhaps one last reminder, and I know that we've already stressed this a bit last time, but let me just take the opportunity once again. Please make sure that you start at least organizing and getting ready for your group work. It's very important that you do not leave this to the last minute, because it's always a bit difficult to organize your group work sessions when you are working online and not physically around the same table. We can provide that virtual space for you to meet online if you need some help in doing that. I know that at least one of the groups has already met and arranged and nominated their spokesperson. So congratulations to the group that has already done that. And for the other two groups, this is the time to get started. And if you need any assistance from our side, feel free to let us know. We're here to support you. That being said, thank you everyone once again for joining. Jean-Pierre, I will pass the floor directly to you. I will say in the background if any support, any backstopping is needed. Thank you very much for being with us today again, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our participants. This is our third session together. You certainly remember that the first two sessions were specifically devoted to the first one to to how actually to the reasons for which, patterns of reintegration vary so much. We based our presentation on empirical data. I spoke about, remember, migration cycles. This is something I will again address today, but very shortly with you. And then the second session, if you remember, we adopted a more, let's say, policy-oriented approach to integration and return. And I explained to you how the reasons for which there has been so much emphasis on the reintegration of migrants, how it is part and parcel of a, let's say, a policy design aimed at turning migration into a temporary policy aimed at ensuring that migrants will go abroad, but then return after a short period, a short experience of migration, which would vary from, let's say, 6 months to 2 years or 3 years anyway. So temporariness is part and parcel of our policies as they stand today. So today we will mix, let's say, this bottom-up approach to return and reintegration with a top-down approach to return and reintegration. How? By focusing on entrepreneur returnees. You all heard about the need to foster the reintegration of migrants when they return to their countries of origin. Very often, There has been a reference to, creating a business concern after return to sustain the reintegration through entrepreneurship. So what does it mean precisely, and which conditions are needed, and which skills and which also circumstances are needed in order, to sustain the reintegration of migrants, but through entrepreneurship. I have prepared, as usual, a PowerPoint presentation for you. Let me open it immediately. I hope you will see it. Let me.
Yes, indeed, we see it. Not yet in full
Okay,
screen, but
full
I
screen
think it's
immediately.
perfect.
Oh, wonderful. So this is actually today's title of our presentation, Return Migrants Reintegration Through Entrepreneurship, with a question mark. And if I put a question mark, is that this is not obvious. We should not take for granted that entrepreneurship will be conducive to reintegration. Why? Because you need preconditions, and there are, of course, stakes at play that need to be taken into consideration. First of all, let me remind you a basic consideration. Well, we talked about it. Remember, return as a stage in the migration cycle. I will really be I'll be very short, very quick, in explaining again. We talked about the complete migration cycle, when people have the opportunity to, to assess the pros and cons of their decision, to return on their own initiative. So these usually are people, we talk about return migrants who had the opportunity to assess, their own the pros and cons of their own decisions. They were able also to organize their return while mobilizing the necessary resources, be they tangible or intangible. Tangible, it refers, of course, to financial aspects, and then to financial resources, and intangible to, let's say, networks, skills, knowledge, all that acquired abroad and then brought back to the country. But then we talked about the incompleteness and interruption of a migration cycle. We said that an incomplete migration cycle, remember, is someone who indeed decides to return, but there are unfavorable factors which motivate return. So actually that person wanted to stay abroad for longer, but that person decided actually to return as a result of unfavorable factors such as racism, lack of economic opportunities. There were also, the failure of a migration project. I mean, there are many reasons, which could motivate a migrant to go back to his or her country of origin, just because there are unfavorable factors which motivated the decisions. And actually, there are more costs in staying abroad than in returning to the country of origin. So, but anyway, resources will be much more scarce. In other words, they will not suffice in order to sustain reintegration. Worse than that, interrupted migration cycle. These are people who never, ever decided to return to the country of origin. They wanted to stay abroad, but because of, disruptive factors, they were obliged to return. So this refers to people who are expelled, to people whose labor permit was not renewed unexpectedly, maybe because policies changed in the country of destination. This refers also to war, to conflict in the destination country. All of a sudden you have to leave immediately. So there's no preparedness. Resources are not necessarily substantial or sufficient. to sustain reintegration, and this in any way will impact inevitably on the propensity to reintegrate back home. But then, well, what types of returnees have been addressed today when we think about it? Well, most of the types of returnees who have been, who have, let's say, benefited from the from policies or from the attention of policymakers usually are people whose return was compelled. In other words, people whose migration cycle was interrupted. So this is what policymakers have focused on predominantly, I would say, here. But actually, this part, when it comes to people who decided to return, be there for favorable or unfavorable circumstances, well, actually, these two categories, complete and incomplete, very often have been dismissed by policymakers. Why so much attention here to people who had a migration cycle interrupted? Well, just because there's no surprise, we are faced with the growing and perceptible securitization of international migration policies. This is no surprise, we know that. And actually, this is totally compliant with an overall trend whereby states, intervene and the law enforcement agencies, by the way, they intervene with a view to, let's say, make sure that people who can no longer stay on their own territory will be removed by an administrative decision very often. So it refers to people who are very often expelled or whatever. But that's why so much attention, as we explained before, was granted to, was paid to people having an interrupted migration cycle. Well, I told you that today we will speak about entrepreneur returnees. So, but why is there so much emphasis today on entrepreneur returnees? Well, to some extent, I have already explained to you why is there so much emphasis. Again, we need to convince countries of origin that there's a reintegration program which will contribute to development, and that migrants will be in a position, to reintegrate and to invest, their tangible and intangible resources, etc. Well, what I would like to show to you today, all that is not obvious, is not automatic. In other words, we need preconditions in order to foster the reintegration of entrepreneur returnees, including, their own propensity to invest back home and possibly, and if not ideally, to recruit, people and to create jobs back home. All that is contingent on certain conditions, which I'm now going to explain to you. But let's first of all address, why is there so much emphasis? So much emphasis because, of course, as I told you before, there's a lot of temporariness in international migration policies. We speak about mobility, circular migration, all what refers to mobility means by definition that it is temporary. There's a temporary duration of the experience of migration. So when we speak about temporariness, it necessarily refers to how a migrant will be in a position to save money, to acquire skills, and to even acquire networks. Networks are important. You know people, you exchange information. All that is absolutely important. This is what you do in your daily working also. You build networks, and they are important in your daily life, I would say. Just like for migrants, they are important. Just like, savings or skills or whatever, they're absolutely crucial because you build resources to some extent. Well, time will inevitably affect the propensity of an individual migrant to collect all these resources. And this is obvious. It occurs also in your life. And well, this is important because all policymakers, especially, I would say, well, in the North, in the West, as we would put it also, are aware that there's the drive for temporariness. But I would add, there's a drive for securitized temporariness. What does it mean? It means that not only are international migration programs today excessively temporary, but they are also securitized. How? Because if a temporary labor migrant comes to a destination country and then overstays the legal duration of his or her labor contract, that person will become irregular. Then what will happen to that person? That person will become irregular and he will be subjected to a removal order, to a return decision, as we put it in Europe, actually. In other words, there will be an order, aimed at ensuring that the person will leave the territory of a destination country because that person is in an irregular situation. All right? So what will happen? There will be a cooperation between the destination country and the country of origin to ensure that that person will be removed, from the territory of a destination country. Well, when we speak about removal or expulsion, you immediately think about an interrupted migration cycle. So will that person be in a position to reintegrate? Usually, there are programs which are nowadays proposed in order to sustain the reintegration even of irregular migrants when these programs exist. And there's also the possibility of having a short training with a view to becoming an entrepreneur back home. Again, this is, I would say, the theory. This is let's say, in an ideal world, okay? But there are hindrances, to these programs, which I'm now going to address with you. Still, so much emphasis, I said to you, also, well, this is, I think, so much emphasis also because on entrepreneurship, because also, well, many countries of origin are characterized by a low degree of absorption of a local labor market. In other words, well, there might be unfavorable conditions, to reintegrate these people, by just, sending them back home and being employed by a local enterprise. Usually, in order to circumvent all that, there will be a program where the return migrant will follow a training with a view to becoming self-employed, or let's say an employer, namely someone who will create jobs anyway. So, well, there are many aspects that need to be considered. The issue of sustainability, the issue of sustainable reintegration is also part and parcel of the Samoa agreement, the one which was adopted last year in 2023. I hope you heard about the Samoa agreement, which covers your countries, namely, especially when it comes to migration issues. There's an emphasis on sustaining the reintegration of migrants, especially in Chapter 4 of the Samoa Agreement. You know that the Samoa Agreement follows the Cotonou Agreement, which existed from 2000 to 2020. And well, this is, let's say, the new program that has been launched in between the EU and the countries in the African, Caribbean regions anyway. So yes, so much emphasis on sustainable reintegration programs, and also all these programs have been launched with a view to, let's say, ensuring the cooperation of countries of origin. It is true that when there is a reintegration program, inevitably the responsiveness of a country of origin will be, let's say, more positive to some extent. There will be something which will ensure that the nationals who return to the country of origin will actually not be unemployed. And this is a very important aspect. Let me skip this slide and let me go directly to entrepreneur returnees. What do we know about these entrepreneur returnees? Who are they, and which factors affect the propensity to become an entrepreneur returnee? Well, we did, as you already know, this survey, this large survey where we collected more than 2,000 interviews. And when we actually collected these interviews in various countries of origin, remember Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, Armenia, and Mali, we also realized that out of the whole sample, up to 30% of our sample could be considered or categorized as entrepreneur returnees. But what you will say to me, my God, this is very high percentage. Indeed, but why? Let me explain to you. The first one is that, of course, when you speak about an entrepreneur returnee, you must make a clear distinction between employers, namely people who create jobs. They employ people, okay? This is extremely good for the development of a country of origin, creating jobs, There are also self-employed people in the formal sector. For example, someone will come back will return and will become a nurse, for example, on his or her own business, in the private sector, especially, or someone who will become, a dentist or a lawyer, or an engineer, and he will be or she will be self-employed, in the formal sector. Absolutely. So there's self-employment. There are also those who will be self-employed, but in the informal sector. Well, the informal sector cannot be dismissed. We have to take into consideration the informal economy, especially in the regions that we covered in the framework of our survey. You cannot do without the informal economy. Otherwise, you will have just a partial image of the economic and social reality. So it's important to take into consideration people who are self-employed, but in the informal sector. Who are they? Just let me give you a few examples. A fruit vendor, for example, in the market, who will, sell fruits. All this is totally undeclared. No tax will be paid, of course. I mean, this is just an economy of survival. But still, that person will have, let's say, the opportunity to earn something, to earn money, call it a salary if you prefer, why not, in the informal economy. Anyway, there are or people, working informally in, for example, the manufacturing industry also, they are, well, officially they don't work, but actually they work. And they are actually just self-employed on their own initiative, they provide, a manpower, which is important. So these are, people who actually have various degrees of entrepreneurship. We have employers and, let's say, self-employed people. So that's quite important. Uh, what are the key factors which, let's say, shape patterns of reintegration? I told you before, well, very quickly, the duration of the experience of migration, time, we talked about temporariness, the context, of course, in both countries of immigration and return, your motivations, why, the reasons for which you returned, of course, and especially the individual decision to return. This is absolutely crucial. And so combined together, all these factors, the four factors, that are on the screen will, let's say, shape patterns of reintegrations. There will be different types of migration cycles and also different levels or degrees of entrepreneurship, which inevitably will differ in terms of resources, market opportunity, the size of the firm, and of course, in terms of job created. Indeed, when we make a distinction, in terms of migration cycle, and when we focus on entrepreneur returnees, look at that graph. It is very interesting. In green, you have interrupted migration cycle, incomplete in red, and complete migration cycles in blue. And you see that employers, namely those who create jobs, let's say the most, if I may, the most, let's say, positive category of entrepreneur returnees, well, we see that these, for most employers, well, the decision to return was made individually. These are people who had the opportunity to weigh the pros and cons of their own initiative to return, etc. Well, maybe you will see here, but still, we have around 12% of people having an interrupted migration cycle who actually became employers. This is a sociological truth. There will always be a minority, which will go against, the rationale for the reflection that I'm trying to introduce with you, indeed. Well, how can we explain, that people having here just 12%, so just 12%, it's a minority, come on, okay, among employers, but still, it's interesting. We isolated in our database, we isolated with these people, analytically speaking, and we tried to understand who are they? How come did they create, a business concern with, which created jobs, which generated, well, I would say some wealth, to some extent. They employed other people, indeed. Well, this was possible because of the community, because of the family, which were behind the entrepreneur returnee having, an interrupted migration cycle. So despite, let's say, the detrimental effects of an interrupted migration cycle, that person was anyway in a position to become an employer thanks to the community or to the family which provided the necessary resources to create the business. So actually, this is quite specific, let's say. You cannot do a policy from that point of view, with an exception, let's put it frankly. The rule, let's say the bottom line, is that actually employers are predominantly people having having a complete migration cycle. And this is very visible. The more you go to people having, well, working for the informal economy, you know, you see that people who work for the informal economy and became entrepreneur returnees, well, these are people who, well, here we see it had an interrupted migration cycle. But if we have a look, you know, we ask them also, well, what across, you know, the three migration stages, in other words, before leaving the country of origin, then abroad, and then at the time of survey, you know, what is the share of our entrepreneur returnees? And we excluded actually irregular self-employed or undeclared self-employed people, you know. We just wanted to know more precisely at the time of a survey, well, how many there were, you know, in terms of share. And we saw that actually back home, usually, there are those who become entrepreneur returnees have predominantly up to 30%, you know, of the sample, you know. Well, they have a complete migration cycle. In other words, in order to become an entrepreneur returnee, predominantly also here, we see that these people are people who had a complete migration cycle. Still, you will say to me, well, sorry, there are also people having an incomplete. I know. But let's say the propensity to become an entrepreneur returnee is superior, you know, among people having a complete migration cycle. Now let's have a more, I would say, historical vision of our sample of entrepreneur returnees with reference to migration cycles. And let's have a look, you know, our people, you know, we made a distinction in terms of first period of immigration. Let me explain to you what it means. It means we ask people, when did you leave for the first time your own country of migration? And people were responding, well, you know, I left during the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and blah, 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 etc. And we tried to discriminate across the first periods of immigration, of migration. And indeed, what we realized by making a distinction in terms of migration cycle, we see that the more we go, you know, from the 1950s to the early 2000s, well, the more we realize that the propensity to having a complete migration cycle is going down. You know, there are less and less opportunities. With reference to this graph, there are less and less opportunities to have a complete migration cycle. Why? Just because, as I told you before, we are heading towards the securitized temporariness of international migration, which reduces the propensity to having a complete migration cycle. This is a big challenge. In other words, conditions, you know, to have a complete migration cycles are just decreasing, you know, which will affect the propensity to become an entrepreneur returnee. And this is what we observed on this graph too. This is very interesting. We still referred to the first periods of emigration, but then we added, you know, a line here, which is the share of entrepreneur returnees. It went up, you know, here until the 1980s, but then it has gradually decreased since the 1980s. And this is very interesting also because it shows a trend which reflects, again, the decreasing opportunities to stay for long period abroad as a result, again, of the securitized temporariness of international migration policies. These are, in a nutshell, let's say, the population, we interviewed in each country, be it Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Armenia and Mali. Absolutely, this is a more precise table where we identified, the entrepreneur returnees by countries of return. Just here you have the 600 and so entrepreneur returnees. They are here, and this is the number of entrepreneur returnees. They are neither employer nor self-employed anyway. And this is the whole sample. You will see certainly that in Tunisia, there are more employers. Why? Certainly because Tunisia is unlike Algeria or even Morocco, but I mean, Algeria or let alone, Armenia or Mali, the economic, let's say, how would I say, the configuration of the economic landscape in Tunisia is very much characterized by the expansion of the private sector. There have been public policies aimed at promoting what is called in Tunisia the freedom to invest, but this for decades and decades, actually. Well, of course, I will not get into the analysis of what it means to be free to invest in Tunisia, especially during the dictatorship of former leader Zine El Abidine Ben Ali. Of course, I'm not going to explain to you what it meant precisely. There was a great deal of corruption. There's still corruption anyway. There were hindrances, etc. Absolutely, but I don't have time, to explain to you the specificities of the economic context in Tunisia compared with Armenia. What I can say to you is that, of course, the type of mobility of people impacts on the propensity to become an entrepreneur returnee. You remember last time during the first session, we talked about Armenia. I told you about the low degree of absorption of the labor market in Armenia. And I told you that so many migrants, that when they return, the only project they had in mind was to leave again the country, Armenia, with a view to seeking new opportunities, in neighboring countries, especially in Russia. Russia was the major destination country, clearly. This is also, there are specific conditions from an economic and macroeconomic point of view, which will impact on the propensity to become an entrepreneur returnee anyway. So here, yes, something which is absolutely, I will skip this slide, it's about the age group of our entrepreneur returnees. We ask them also here a very interesting table, where we ask them, what did you do before becoming an entrepreneur returnee? And we isolated only the employers and the self-employed in the formal sector. Well, we see that, for most of them, when they were abroad before returning, a lot of them were employees. So these are people who acquired skills, acquired skills. They had also savings, a salary, certainly networks, etc. But they were also people, look at that, who worked in the informal economy in the destination country. This is very interesting. These are people who, for some of them, were working in the informal economy abroad, even before, by the way, before leaving the country of destination, but then who became afterwards, entrepreneur returnees. There's a transition. This is very interesting. Here, a lot, before leaving their own country of origin, they were already, students, 16% here. I don't know whether you see my arrow anyway, but well, anyway, 16%, and then, well, abroad afterwards, as I said to you, well, they were either self-employed, yes, but also, employees working for business concern in the private sector abroad. And then they had enough saving for some of them in order to create their own concerns and to becoming, employers here. That's
Jean-Pierre, we can see your arrow. Huh? It's
very good. Very good. So I'm glad you can see it because sometimes very good. Thank you, Mario. Well, what is the sectoral distribution of these business concerns? Well, if we isolate, the countries in North Africa, for example, Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia. Well, very often these are these are entrepreneur returnees who predominantly, will work in the hospitality sector, trade also, trade sector predominantly. But this is not surprising at all. There's also a high propensity in the agricultural sector, 12%, 13% here. We can see it here, actually. You see agriculture, quite important in Morocco also. But well, predominantly you see these are the main two sectors, but this is not surprising, actually. These are sectors, industrial sectors, which have been quite privileged in terms of public investments in these countries, and that's why there has been so much traction from these two sectors. If we look at Armenia and Mali, the same more or less observation. Transport is also quite important. Agricultural, the agriculture and fisheries sectors, absolutely. Predominantly, anyway, it's always trade. Trade will remain anyway the main sector where these entrepreneur returnees will focus predominantly anyway. And indeed, many reintegration programs usually focus on the trade sector, also in the service sector. This is not true. But anyway, especially in the trade sector, these are actually the main areas where business activities will be promoted anyway. This is actually a graph which, let's say, is exactly a reflection of what we've just seen, across even the three categories of entrepreneur returnees: employers, self-employed, in the formal economy, and in informal economy. So predominantly, the trade sector will be the area where all entrepreneur returnees, be they employers or self-employed, will, let's say, be concentrated anyway. Let's have a look at this. Well, it's a bit complex, but I will explain to you what it means. This refers to you remember I told you about tangible, intangible resources. I told you about intangible resources. It means, networks. It means about it means also well, it refers to skills, etc. And this graph actually focuses on let's say, networks, on social capital, on contacts, you know. We ask them, well, did you contact a lot your family in the country of origin? Did you visit your country of origin very often before returning for good to your to your country of origin? Did you speak about the return project with your friends and your relatives? Did you speak about, you know, your idea of creating a business, you know? And we made a distinction, you know, among employers, self-employed, and in the formal economy and in informal economy. The more it goes to one, this is, you know, a diagram which shows that it goes from 0 to 1, and the higher the propensity to visit or to having contacts with the family or to speak about the return project, you know, and the more and the higher the, you know, the coefficient, you know, of a specific category. So employers, you see, are those who actually in blue here, are those who actually visit more or visited most often, you know, their own country of origin. There are those who spoke about very often about their project. There are those about also who, let's say, acquired contacts with families, but also friends, actually, we did not mention it, in the country of origin. And well, when it comes to, well, this is logical. This is people, again, who had the opportunity and the time to elaborate their own business project, to think about it, to visit the country before returning, which is so important in order to understand, you know, how the market is structured, whether there are real opportunities, how I can invest my money, in under which conditions, etc., etc. It's obvious, but people being self-employed in the informal economy here, you know, and we are here more precisely, well, these are people who will really have a lower, much lower propensity to visit. It's almost irrelevant. Contacts, of course, there will be contacts, but not necessarily the contacts needed to create a business concern anyway. And they probably have spoken about their project, you know, to return with friends and relatives. Yes, but this is not what will contribute, you know, to their having to their running a business concern back home, to invest money, unlike actually employers here. Again, it's not only a question of money, it's not only a question of economic structure back home in the country of origin, it's also a question of preparedness, of readiness, if you prefer, of how you will have the opportunity to visit the country of origin. This is crucial. And of course, people having, you know, people being self-employed, remember, well, most of them working in the informal economy, most of them, we showed in our survey that they will have an interrupted migration cycle. So there will be an interruption in their own migration projects. And certainly most of these people will be how would I say, taken care of by public bodies or NGOs, you know, aimed at ensuring that these people become entrepreneur returnees at the end, you know, when they return to their own country of origin. But still, having an interrupted migration cycle, resources will never suffice in the long term to sustain the business project of these people. But again, it's because it requires not only money, it requires preparedness, it requires also structural conditions back home which would be favorable or sustainable, if you prefer, anyway. Yes, time is important. Employers having usually, not exclusively, not all of them. I know I showed it to you, but most employers have a complete migration cycle. Most of them. Remember, up to 65%. Well, it shows anyway that the type of migration cycle will definitely have an impact on the propensity to create jobs back home. Just because time is important. It is important indeed. It will refer, you will see here how important people having more time to stay will have a higher propensity to become entrepreneur returnees. Here we see more precisely on this graph, we made a distinction in terms of duration of experience of migration by profiles of entrepreneurs, employers, self-employed, and well, in the formal economy and in the informal economy here, sorry. And we see that employers, namely those who create jobs, are quite scattered all across the duration of the experience of migration. Some of them have up to 20, 25, 50, 13 years of experience of migration. I mean, it's a lot, actually. These are people who stayed for very long period abroad, actually, and who had savings, who decided on their own initiative, for many reasons anyway, to stay abroad, and then they decided afterwards to return on their own initiative and to create their own businesses. So that's important. What can we say to conclude across with all this information, which are so important in order to make a distinction between various degrees of entrepreneurship? Well, the experiences of entrepreneur returnees shed light on the analytical relevance of migration cycles. And we show that there's a correlation between the completeness of a migration cycle and the propensity to becoming an employer. It's obvious, but we have to say it anyway, that not all returnees can become entrepreneurs. Even if you are supported by supported, that's a word I was looking for, by a public institution, a program, an EU funded project, an IOM funded project or whatever. It's not because you will be supported that you will automatically become an entrepreneur returnee anyway. Well, yes, younger generations of return migrants are less and less inclined to invest in job-creating business concerns after their return, while they are gradually moving towards self-employment in the formal and informal sectors more than the elders do, because, again, of the temporariness of international migration policies. Well, there are also structural factors that have a decisive impact on the propensity to becoming an entrepreneur returnees. And so these elements, structural factors, the migration cycles, the fact that time impacts or affects the propensity to become an entrepreneur returnee, well, all that will inevitably affect the propensity to becoming an entrepreneur returnees. And these are the elements on which I would like to focus today with this presentation. If you have any questions, I will be happy to reply to you and to discuss with you. Thank you for your attention. Oh my God, we have 3 people, maybe. Or
Thank you. No, thank you, Jean-Pierre. No. We have
no
our
more.
usual.
Okay,
Yes, we have
sorry.
our usual
Well,
around 12. We have received two questions that I think are a bit that are related one to the other. So I'll try to put the two together. One from Victor and one from Delvin. So Victor is asking, and I think this question came a little further back in your presentation, and he's saying, when can we ever have an effective reintegration? So it speaks to the criteria that we use to measure the effectiveness and the sustainability of reintegration. He's asking, when is reintegration said to be really effective and sustainable? And then Delvin is expanding this a little bit more, saying, can you share some examples of reintegration programs that have been deemed sustainable?
Okay, good. So first of all, the notion of effectiveness, having worked, I would say, extensively on return and reintegration, from a political point of view, from a more empirical point of view, interviewing migrants clearly, but also analyzing policies, confronting various perspectives, I have to say. The notion of effectiveness is extremely elusive. It is elusive. Effectiveness with regard to what? With regard to your own policy as a country of destination, with regard to the policy of a country of origin, with regard to the migrant, maybe. It's important. Effective with regard to what? That people reintegrate. I told you last time, during the first session, that return should never be viewed as, let's say, the end of a migration cycle. People want sometimes, and very often, they want to leave again for abroad. So return can be permanent, it's true, but it can be also temporary. Just because people need to be mobile, because mobility is a source of development, not only for the individual, but for a country, something that very often we don't really remember. Mobility is a source of development. That's why people return. Yes, they return. Many of them, believe me, return on a temporary basis because they are absolutely aware that it's good, to be mobile between two or many countries, because it sustains the development. This is sustainability from my point of view, I would say. Now, effective reintegration. I understood your question clearly. You want to say, well, people who are, let's say, contributing to the economic, social, political life of the country of origin, clear, of course. Well, it's when actually there are conditions which are akin to sustaining the reintegration of a migrant. But these conditions should be promoted not only by public institutions, they should also be fostered by policies which are already defined in the country of destination, so long before the person returns to the country of origin. So that's why I told you, even during the first session, and I repeat it again today, because it's really the epitome. I mean, the entrepreneurship of returnees, regardless of the degrees of entrepreneurship, employers, self-employed, anyway. But all these experiences are shaped by policies which were adopted in the destination country and have been adopted in the country of return of origin, usually. So inevitably, reintegration is not only a factor which will be determined by the conditions in the country of return. There are already conditions in the country of destinations which will definitely affect the propensity of a person to reintegrate and to, in this case, because today we spoke about entrepreneur returnees, but to becoming an entrepreneur returnee, or even ideally an employer anyway. So reintegration is a question of time, of duration, of opportunities, of resources, but time affects all that. your propensity to gather the needed resources, to reintegrate afterwards. It's a question also of agency. Agency, it's a word maybe which you heard already, but it means of, I would say, self-determination, to put it simply to some extent. Well, now, are there good examples of sustainable reintegration programs? My reply is very clear. As long as you take into consideration the duration of the experience of migration, the conditions back home, you adopt also mitigating measures aimed at addressing the inefficiencies of your own structural of your own economic structure in the labor market in the country of origin. Well, this would be already a sustainable reintegration program. Now, you ask me to name maybe a potential reintegration program. Honestly, I don't know whether I am really in a position to name or to say, well, this is a very good, this is a good practice. Because honestly, I don't see any good practice when it comes to the reintegration of migrants back home. Maybe one, which is in the Philippines, I would agree. Or when there have been, programs defined by the Filipino public institutions, with a view to sustaining the reintegration of their own nationals back home, then yes, I would say that this is, let's say, a good example to some extent. Is it replicable to other contexts? I don't know, because I need to know the other context, which, I'm not in a position to do so. So that's the only reply that I could provide to you exactly. All of I don't understand exactly all of that, migrants policy, etc. Okay. Yes. Okay.
Yes.
I saw someone maybe.
There was a raised hand exactly that was there and then went away. I think it was Victor again. Over
Yes,
to you.
my
Thank
hand
you.
was ready.
Victor
Yes, thank
Chambers.
you very much. I am just immersed or impressed by your depth of knowledge and experience. From your response, you could feel that you have years of experience and you are talking profoundly, you are speaking profoundly, and you don't have it seems you don't have all the answers. It's a very profound question you don't have. I was really going to, a lot of thoughts are running in my mind, but to put them into perspective, I am looking at reintegration, not only of migrants. Our focus here is on migrants.
Yes.
I'm looking at refugee situation, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I am looking at reintegration of, let's say, people from prison. I am looking at reintegration of, different forms of, or ex-combatants, so to speak. I'm putting all of that together. That I'm giving you a background of my question. Putting all of that together, our focus is on migrants who have returned to their home countries.
Yes.
But beyond that, I am going steps further. I'm also looking at refugee situations. For example,
I see.
Look at, let me focus a little bit more or deep dive into the situation of Syria and the Middle East, for example.
Yes.
Lebanon.
Mm-hmm.
People have migrated from, say, Syria. and there is a particular situation in their country or in the Middle East, situations, circumstances beyond their control, they have migrated and their migration has been interrupted, the return, and we are looking at entrepreneurship in this case. You know, they just begin again to get their life developed or sustained or evolved, and then something else interrupted it. Or people have moved from prison. You are trying to reintegrate them socially, psychologically, economically into society. And then something happens again, they get involved in another problem, and they have to go back to prison. And that is our experience for some of us who are in the field. I was looking at that. When do you really say this reintegration is effective and is it sustainable? And from your response, I've seen that it's really hard to put a finger on the pulse to say that this particular vivid example, you can use it as a successful, sustainable reintegration process.
Yeah, I think you replied to your own question, if I may. As you said,
I wanted to hear from somebody who has long years of experience also from your perspective. We live in different geographical contexts. Maybe our experiences resonate.
Where are you based, Mr. Chambers?
I am in the West African country. Presently, I'm based in Togo.
Togo, okay.
Yes, presently.
Presently, okay. Well, I said to you, of course, but you almost replied to your own question. You said, you know, that these are people, well, who were in prison and then who were, you said returned, but I mean, because this is the official rhetoric, you know, these are not returned people, these are expelled people, people who, anyway, after they, you know, having been, sorry, in prison, they are expelled to the country of origin, and now they have to reintegrate. Well, as I said, even during the first session, and I repeat it again, expulsion is so traumatic, so stigmatizing, so, I mean, it's a trauma, really. It's extremely challenging to even believe that a short-term project aimed at reintegrating people expelled after a prison, especially, you know, to a country, they will be, you know, expelled from abroad to the country of origin. Well, that these people, thanks to this project, this short-term project, because it will last for 1-2 years, usually, you know, 2 years maximum, but these people will overcome the reality. It is so, again, as I told you, stigmatizing. It's a trauma. It's humiliating. And I met people like this. I interviewed a lot of people, especially in Morocco, to be honest with you. And the only perspective in their mind, when even they were attending reintegration projects, so, you know, benefiting from a form of training, etc., the only project was to leave again. Because with regard to the local community, they had to demonstrate that they had the capacity, you know, to, how would I say, well, to have their own, to achieve something, you know, even after what happened to them. And, well, speaking about reintegration, wow, it's a long-term perspective with regard to this specific category of people. I'm not talking about returned migrants from a general point of view. I'm speaking about people, you know, who lived a trauma, you know, for various reasons. Anyway, so yes, it will be a long process, and certainly there are projects which require much more than a mere training in becoming an entrepreneur or whatever. You know, they require assistance, psychological assistance. This is extremely important. These are people who need to be reconstructed. So this is what reintegration also implies, not from an economic point of view, but much more from a psychological point of view. And this cannot be dismissed, in my opinion. I mean, it's important to recognize the relevance of all that. Anyway, I hope I replied to your question. It is so important. This is an important question because, Mr. Chambers, as you rightly underscored, actually, this category of return migrants, even as I told you, these are people who are expelled. And you need to make a distinction between people who are expelled from people who return. You know, those who are expelled, you know, inevitably will be confronted with a trauma because it's again stigmatizing, very much stigmatizing. You understand when you speak with these people. I mean, they are treated like criminals. They are totally isolated, stigmatized. They were handcuffed. Some of them never ever understood what happened to them, you know. And with regard to the community back home, they don't even disclose. For the luckiest, I would say, they don't disclose the real reasons for which they were expelled from abroad, you know, because it would be too humiliating, too stigmatizing again. So they live in a different world, I would say. That's it. Indeed. Yeah.
Thank you, Jean-Pierre, and thank you, Victor, for bringing up the point. There's a comment from Yvonne on the same issue, saying that your question resonates very strongly, Victor. There are more questions than answers, and Yvonne is saying, I think in the context of my country, Nigeria, the economic, political, and social infrastructure negatively affects the level of effectiveness and sustainability of reintegration.
Yeah.
And this is seen especially when returning migrants have limited support from family and home networks. And even with skills and education, successful reintegration is quite difficult to measure in Nigeria. And mobility is also becoming extremely difficult in general because of the economic structure.
Absolutely. Definitely. I subscribe, you know, to this statement. Definitely. Absolutely. There's another one which I found from Mrs. Georgia Noy.
Exactly. I was going to
An
bring that up. It's a
interesting
very
one.
interesting
Come
point.
on.
I don't know, Georgia, if you want to read the question yourself, if
Oh,
you're...
Are you able to hear me?
Yes, loud and
yes,
clear.
yes.
Okay. Okay, great. Yeah, my question was, I guess, just through common sense here and around the Pacific of what we've experienced, like absolutely, like all the statistics and great graphs that you've been showing over the last couple of weeks. The statistics and graphs, they coincide and they align with our experience that reintegration absolutely is more effective only when it's talked throughout the whole labour mobility or labour migration cycle. And we kind of didn't know what to call it here, so we called it pre-reintegration. So it's been lovely to discuss the terminology. But I mean, it's very obvious and evident through practical application and through research. So is the only and then it was disappointing to hear you say, you know, there's not really many good examples, and we've even found here in the Pacific that it's difficult to do because it's so expensive and costly. So is that the main reason? Do you think that it's not done well, or why is it done well in the Philippines and not anywhere else?
It's done well in the Philippines, as, to be honest with you, after, I would say, more than 20 years of research, be it empirical, analytical, even theoretical, working on these issues, I would say yes, that the Philippines would be a good example of a country which decided on its own initiative to produce its own statistics, to having its own autonomy in collecting data, defining its own policies with regard to its own priorities and contingencies, of course. So that's one reason. The other reason is that this is a country, in my opinion, which has defined its own policies by focusing on, let's say, on migrants, on Filipino return migrants' specific experiences first and foremost, while addressing their own needs. And this is also another aspect which I would like to emphasize from that point of view. They put at this was, let's say, this has been a return migrants focused policy, which has been defined, by the authorities with a view to sustaining their own conditions after return. Now, successfully, unsuccessfully, depends on many factors now. We are getting into the details. But you said to me, you were asking this interesting question, why is it? I mean, it's so evident, when you speak about reintegration, migration cycles, that of course people having a complete migration cycle, we have a higher propensity to reintegrate. The problem is that people having a complete migration cycle are less and less numerous. Why? Because there's a global trend in the so-called governance of international migration, which has been sustained by so many talks and consultations, at a bilateral, multilateral level. There's the drive for temporariness. Why is there the drive for temporariness? Because there's a design behind it, clearly. All countries of migration need migrants. Migrants are a resources, but they don't need migrants' families. And in order to ensure that they don't get settled, okay, we need to make sure that they come on a temporary basis. So there's circulation, there's mobility. There will be an interruption of the experience of migration, for example, based on a short duration of a labor contract, 1 year, 2 years, but this will never be enough to entitle you to bring your families, because in some countries you need to leave for many years, usually 5 years in a row, in order to acquire rights, in order to be able to bring your family. So family reunification exists, of course, but it is today far less facilitated by public policies. And that's why there's the drive for temporariness, in order to bring the labor, but not labor migrants' families, So that's why temporariness impacts inevitably on the propensity to acquire skills, to earn, to have savings, to have contacts, to have knowledge, social capital, you remember? Anyway, all these elements will inevitably shape your propensity to reintegrate afterwards. That's why. So that's why you say, wow, but it's so evident. Yes, it is evident, you're right. But I mean, people, but they don't want to promote that. Because if you promote, the completeness of migration cycle, you have to do without the temporariness of of labor migration. You know, you must, you know, well, make sure that people have the time to stay for longer period. Will they bring their families? Yes, maybe. Oh, that's not good. So there will be hindrances, etc., etc. And it's a global trend. It's not only in the north, even in Africa, you know, they are like this. You know, there's a lot of instability from that point of view, I would say. Yes, one would think for Georgia. I'm just reading your comment. Okay, right. One would think focus on and policies and resources would be put into reintegration because destination country want them to return to country of origin. Yes, absolutely. I mean, of course, they have a vision of reintegration. Let's say, let's put it this way, which is not, well, the one that would, well, there's, you know, that very many reintegration projects or programs which are promoted by, you know, IOM, most of them. I mean, these are short-term programs for 1 year, maybe 2 years, and it depends on what they mean by reintegration. You know, it's very much, you know, a slogan. You know, we will sustain the reintegration of people, etc. But I mean, it's all that has to be anyway examined more carefully. Anyway, well, interesting comments from you. Thank you.
Thank you indeed. Thank you to everyone who intervened today. Thank you, Jean-Pierre, for taking the time to guide us through this interesting and perhaps a little bit challenging topic.
Yeah.
Thank you for being with us throughout the
There's
entire
no
course.
automatic reply. It's
Exactly.
important to be modest, you know, and to recognize that, you know, there's no one size fits all reply. Oh my God. You know, everybody
Indeed.
now is speaking about good practices, best practices, but where are they? I mean, how you can say that this is a good practice for, I mean, is it really replicable? Not really. I mean, there are reasons for which maybe it has been successful for now, okay, because we have to be careful also. Just have a long-term analysis of all that. It's important.
Absolutely, and thank you very much for your support in guiding us through this topic. So Professor Cassarino will be with us again on the last session of the course, which is on 18th of October for the discussion of the group work results. So we look forward to having you back then. And for everyone else, the next session in this course will be next Tuesday with the session on gender and how gender impacts and influences the reintegration process. So that will be a panel discussion with 3 colleagues from different regions in the world. So we're hoping to be able to hear as well, as you say, these emerging, let's call them emerging practices, and see what conclusion we can draw from them, and if there are elements that can serve as inspiration as well for other regions. Thank you all once again. You will receive, as usual, a notification in advance of the session next week to remind you of the link to join. And in the meantime, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. We're happy to help from our side. Thank you all, and have a lovely rest of the day.
Thank you.